Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's keynote webinar titled Psychological Insights, Not Metaphysical Beliefs, Drive Psychedelic Benefits. This webinar is a part of the Cannabis Sciences virtual event series. I am Sydney Panilla of LabRoots, and I will be your moderator for today's event. Today's web seminar is presented by LabRoots. Before we begin, I would like to remind everyone that this event is interactive. We encourage you to participate by communicating with other attendees using our live chat feature during the presentation. You can find the live chat located at the bottom left of your screen. You can also participate by submitting as many questions as you would like during the presentation. To do so, simply type them into the Ask a Question box and click Submit. We will answer as many questions as we have time for at the end of the presentation. If you happen to have any trouble seeing or hearing the presentation, click on the Help Desk button from the lobby within the event. And finally, as a reminder, this presentation is educational and offers free continuing education credits. Click on the continuing education credits link located within the abstract on the left of your screen and follow the process to obtain your credits. Now let's get started. I now present today's speaker, Kaitlyn White, Scientific Affairs Manager, Radical Science. For a complete biography on our speakers, please find it to the left of your screen. Kaitlyn, you may now begin your presentation.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Sydney. Hi, everyone. Thank you for being here with me today. As Sydney mentioned, I'm Kaitlyn White. I am a Scientific Affairs Manager at Radical Science. My background is in psychology and evolutionary science and data analytics. And much of my previous research has focused on cognition, personality, and emotions, as well as how altered states of consciousness induced by psychedelics may translate into meaningful, lasting change. I've been especially focused on a question that seems simple but keeps popping up, which is, why do psychedelics help some people so profoundly? A lot of narratives around the benefits of psychedelics have leaned on metaphysical or spiritual explanations, ideas like ego death, mystical union, or universal truth. And while those experiences can definitely be powerful and subjectively meaningful, they may not be the actual mechanism driving the improvements that we're seeing from psychedelic use. So what I'm going to argue today is that it's not the metaphysical belief system that matters for seeing benefits from psychedelics. It's the insights people gain, the realizations a person may have about themselves or their lives or their behaviors during a psychedelic experience. That distinction has huge implications for how we design treatments, communicate with users of psychedelics, and understand what these substances are actually doing. So let's get into it. Over the last decade, psychedelics have rapidly gained interest in culture, wellness practices, and research. They're no longer confined to clinical trial spaces or underground communities. Instead, they're showing up in wellness retreats, startups, and public discourse. I'm sure we've all heard it. And seemingly for a very good reason. In clinical context, studies have found that psychedelics may offer therapeutic potential for a range of mental health issues like depression, anxiety, post-traumatic stress disorder, addiction, eating disorders. I've even seen some research that looks at how chronic pain is improved from psychedelics. So there's real excitement around psychedelics right now, and it's understandable and supported by a growing body of evidence. Even in naturalistic or non-clinical settings, we're seeing some really interesting reports from psychedelic use. Many people report long-lasting, enduring changes like increased well-being or life satisfaction, or even improved sleep and improved diet or improved exercise habits. And hugely, these haven't just been fleeting effects that are reported. They're lasting weeks or months or even seemingly indefinitely. But we still don't fully understand why some people are walking away from their psychedelic experiences with profound psychological improvements while others don't. So it's kind of a mystery around what is really driving these psychedelic benefits. As researchers have tried to understand why psychedelics sometimes lead to lasting improvements in mental health or well-being, two major theories have emerged. The first is called metaphysical belief theory. And this theory proposes that the benefits of psychedelics come from adopting new, comforting, and often supernatural or spiritual beliefs about the world or the universe or reality in general after having a mystical experience during a psychedelic use. The second theory is called predictive self-binding theory, and it offers a different explanation. It suggests that the real driver of long-term benefits following psychedelic use isn't the metaphysical belief system that results from these experiences, but rather it's the psychological insight that people have during these experiences. Both theories agree that something about the subjective experience matters for the benefits we're seeing, but they don't agree on what exactly is doing the heavy lifting. So I want to take a closer look at both of these theories. And first, we'll look at metaphysical beliefs theory. All right, so metaphysical belief theory builds on a well documented phenomenon in psychedelic research, which is the mystical experience. Mystical experiences often include a sense of unity and connection, feeling at one with life and the universe, ego dissolution, an altered sense of time and space, overwhelmingly positive emotion or elation or euphoria, and the feeling of having access some deeper truth or ultimate reality, something that's more real, more true than everyday life itself. Additionally, it's really common for these experiences to be very difficult to describe, if not completely indescribable, by the person who had the experience. According to metaphysical belief theory, what drives the benefits we're seeing isn't just the intensity of these mystical experiences, it's the lasting shift in the metaphysical belief that the person will hold following the mystical experience. For example, someone could have an intense mystical experience while on a psychedelic and come to believe that consciousness exists outside of the body or that everything in the universe is fundamentally connected. And these kinds of beliefs can be comforting and meaningful, especially if you're struggling with fear or grief or existential distress. So, from this perspective, it's the adoption of these new, often supernatural or spiritual belief that explains the improvements that we're sometimes seeing after psychedelic use. And while this theory certainly has intuitive appeal and very strong correlational support, there's still a question that it leaves open, which is what about the people who are experiencing profound benefits following psychedelic use, but who haven't adopted new metaphysical beliefs after their experience? And so, well, predictive self binding theory offers a suggestion for this, an alternate view to the idea that psychedelic benefits come from adopting new metaphysical beliefs. Instead, predictive self binding theory suggests that the real driver of positive change is the psychological insight that people gain during these psychedelic experiences. It's a shift in how people are understanding themselves, their general patterns and behavior, and their relationships. This theory proposes that psychedelics temporarily relax rigid self models, which makes it easier for new information to break through. Essentially, it suggests that psychedelics relax prior assumptions, resulting in the user being temporarily more malleable in their thinking and their self representations, which opens the door to meaningful realizations, big aha moments. Now, that doesn't mean that other elements don't matter, of course. Ego dissolution, which is the sense of the self dissolving or softening, may be what allows those rigid mental frameworks to loosen in the first place. And going into a psychedelic experience with a mindset for healing or personal growth, where you have a goal in mind, basically having therapeutic intent going into it, may increase the chance that a person will have psychological insights that are actually helpful for them. So, together, these elements may work as catalysts, and they may help set the stage for potential insights. But ultimately, it's the insights that people come away with that this theory suggests make the biggest difference in their outcomes following the psychedelic experience. And there is some growing evidence in support of this idea. Qualitative studies have shown that people often credit their improvements following psychedelic experiences to new perspectives on their life, not to mystical or metaphysical experiences. And quantitative work has found that psychological insight is more strongly associated with beneficial outcomes than mystical experiences are. And this could include reductions in depression or anxiety, substance use. I've even seen stuff on personality changes where neuroticism was lowered or openness to experience was increased. And importantly, many of these benefits have been reported even when no mystical experience ever even occurred. So, while ego dissolution and therapeutic intent may facilitate the process, this theory of predictive self binding proposes that it's the actual insight, not the shifts in metaphysical beliefs, that's doing the real work in creating these beneficial outcomes that we're seeing. So, now that we've unpacked the core logic behind each of these theories, I want to take a closer look at what they actually predict, because understanding that is how we can know how to test them. So, metaphysical belief theory makes a fairly straightforward claim. If the theory is correct, then adopting new metaphysical or spiritual, supernatural beliefs should be the key driver of long term benefits following psychedelic use. People who walk away from their psychedelic experience with stronger beliefs in things like interconnectedness or a higher power or some form of cosmic truth should be the people who report the greatest improvements. And at the same time, this theory predicts that those same belief shifts should protect an individual from experiencing negative outcomes following a psychedelic experience, like increased anxiety or depression, for example. The second theory here, predictive self-binding theory, makes a different set of predictions. If this theory is correct, then psychological insight, not metaphysical beliefs, should emerge as the main predictor of who benefits following a psychedelic experience. And predictive self-binding theory also predicts that psychological insight should also lower the rates of negative outcomes. So again, that kind of protective of negative outcomes should you have these psychological insights. So both theories expect a single key factor to explain who will benefit and who won't, but they just disagree about what that factor is. It's either metaphysical beliefs or psychological insights. And they make clear predictions. So this is where empirical testing comes in. And that is exactly what some colleagues and I did. To test these two competing theories, we turned to a fascinating and truly underutilized source of data, which is arrowhead.org. If you're not familiar with it, Arrowhead is a massive online archive of real-world drug experience reports. It's been around for decades, and it's one of the largest open source collection of psychoactive experiences anywhere online that I'm aware of. There are over 38,000 entries in total. At least there were when we did this study. And these reports on Arrowhead are not written for researchers. They're totally unsolicited, anonymous, and long form. It's just people writing up what happened to them during their experience simply because they want to. And what makes these reports particularly valuable is their richness. They include the context of the experience, the emotional tone, any personal reflections they may have had going into it or during the experience, and the perceived outcomes of the experience. So not just the substances people took, but what they actually took away from the experience. For our analysis, we randomly selected 240 psychedelic experience reports from this archive from Arrowhead, and we focused on classic psychedelics like psilocybin and LSD and DMT, and we only included reports that involved no other substances so that we could isolate the effects of the psychedelic experience itself. And the results of this process was a unique and deeply human data set, one that allowed us to examine which factors actually show up in the narratives of people who report positive changes after these psychedelic experiences, and whether those align more with metaphysical beliefs theory or predictive self-binding theory. Once we had our 240 reports, we coded each one for the core variables predicted by the two theories that we were testing. First, we looked at therapeutic intent, which is whether the person seemed to be using the psychedelic with a goal in mind, like healing or personal growth or working through something difficult. And this helped us understand whether the mindset of the person going into the experience played a role in what they took away or what happened during the experience. Second, we looked at ego dissolution, which is the extent to which the person described a breakdown or a softening of their sense of self. And that includes things like losing boundaries, feeling like they merged with their environment, or even temporarily forgetting who they are, forgetting their identity. Next, we coded for metaphysical belief shifts, which is the key variable predicted to matter most by metaphysical beliefs theory. And that was essentially, did the person come away with new beliefs about the universe, the nature of reality, or a spiritual realm? On the other side, we looked at psychological insight, the variable most important for predictive self binding theory. And these were moments where people reported realizations about themselves or their relationships or their life in general. Things like, I finally understood why I do that, or I saw how I'd been holding on to something from my past. And then finally, we assessed outcomes, whether the person reported any lasting effects, and whether those effects were positive, beneficial, or negative, detrimental. And that included things like reduced anxiety or depression, improved relationships, or changes in substance use, or even just changes in their general well being. And together, these variables allowed us to directly test the predictions of both theories and see which one actually shows up in the stories of people who say their lives changed after a psychedelic experience. So here is what we found. We ran a structural equation model. And when we ran this to test all the variables at once, only one factor variable emerged as a consistent and significant predictor of outcomes, and that was psychological insight. It was the only variable that predicted both more beneficial outcomes and fewer negative ones. And importantly, it fully mediated the effects of both ego dissolution and therapeutic intent. So that just basically means that ego dissolution and intent were still meaningful, but their influence on the outcomes worked entirely through the insights that people reported. So while a person might enter the experience with strong intentions or have a mind expanding moment where the ego drops away, it was the insight that follows, the new perspective, the shift in their self understanding that actually appears to drive the long term transformation and benefits. And this directly supports the predictions made by predictive self binding theory. And it challenges the idea that metaphysical belief alone is the engine behind these effects. One of the clearest findings from our analysis was that metaphysical belief changes did not predict outcomes. They didn't predict more benefits, they didn't predict more harms. So, in other words, even when people came away from their experience with strong spiritual or supernatural beliefs, those changes didn't actually predict lasting improvements in their mental health, their behavior, or their well being. And that means we found no support for metaphysical belief theory as the primary explanation for psychological benefits. That doesn't mean these benefits or these belief shifts, are unimportant or meaningless to the individual. Many people find them to be deeply valuable. But as a scientific explanation for what drives these transformations, these benefits, the evidence points elsewhere. And where it points over and over again is back to insight. So, if insight is the key driver of psychedelic benefits, the next question becomes, what leads to insight? And as I mentioned, we found two variables that reliably predicted whether someone had a meaningful psychological insight in their experience or not. The first was ego dissolution, that loosening or dissolving of the self. When people described a temporary collapse of their usual self model, they were more likely to report personal realizations afterwards. And that may be that their usual self model essentially broke down in a way that allowed them to examine it from a different perspective. And the second variable was therapeutic intent, going into the experience with a clear desire to grow or heal or work through something they were dealing with was predictive of these insights. So that mindset seemed to create a psychological readiness that increased the chances of these insights emerging. So while insight is doing the heavy lifting in terms of these outcomes, both beneficial and detrimental, ego dissolution and intent appear to be the conditions that make those insights more likely to occur. And that gives us a much more actionable picture, not just what drives change, but ways we can support it or maybe even help it to come about. So, cannabis isn't classified as a psychedelic. It doesn't consistently induce the kinds of perceptual or self boundary shifts we see with substances like psilocybin or LSD, classic psychedelics. But in real world settings, especially outside of clinical trials, cannabis is commonly used alongside psychedelics. People often co use cannabis with psilocybin or LSD or DMT, particularly in recreational or exploratory contexts where the boundaries between substances can blur. And that raises an interesting question. Could cannabis be playing an unrecognized role in shaping the psychedelic experience? Does it enhance the effects or modulate the intensity of a psychedelic experience, make insights more or less likely? In other words, does it matter if you consume cannabis with a psychedelic? And that's what researchers have started to investigate, and the results are pretty surprising. In a 2021 study, a team of researchers set out to explore exactly this question: what happens when people combine cannabis with classic psychedelics like LSD or psilocybin? They used data from over 300 participants who planned to take a psychedelic in a naturalistic setting, and they looked at the subjective experiences of these participants based on whether and how much cannabis was used alongside the psychedelic. And what they found looks very promising. The more cannabis people used, the stronger their reported ego dissolution. There was a clear dose response pattern where higher doses of cannabis were associated with more intense feelings of self boundary loss or ego dissolution on average, even when controlling for setting and other contextual variables. So while cannabis isn't typically thought to induce ego dissolution on its own, it may amplify or potentiate this aspect of a psychedelic experience when the two are combined, when you combine cannabis with a psychedelic. So that opens up a new question. Could cannabis be contributing to the very effects, like psychological insight, that are central to how psychedelics work and provide these beneficial outcomes? So here's where it all starts to come together. In our psychedelic study, we found that ego dissolution predicted psychological insight, and insight predicted positive outcomes. So that gives us a clear pathway. Ego dissolution leads to insight, leads to benefits. Meanwhile, in the 2021 study on co use of cannabis and psychedelics, higher cannabis doses were associated with stronger ego dissolution when combined with the psychedelics. So the path there is cannabis plus psychedelic leads to ego dissolution. So if we put these two findings side by side, a pretty compelling possibility emerges that cannabis might amplify the very pathway that leads to psychological transformation following a psychedelic experience. Not by causing insights directly necessarily, but by increasing the likelihood of ego dissolution, which in turn makes insights more likely. That positions cannabis not as a psychedelic substitute, but as a potential amplifier, a compound that may boost the conditions under which psychedelics can lead to meaningful change. It's a hypothesis, not a conclusion, but it's a hypothesis worth exploring. Of course, this is still very early stage thinking. The cannabis plus psychedelic synergy hypothesis I just described is compelling, but it definitely needs direct testing. We need controlled studies that specifically look at how cannabis affects the psychedelic experience, especially in terms of ego dissolution, insight, and outcomes. And it's not just about whether cannabis is used or not. The timing, whether it's before they take the psychedelic, during, right at the peak of the psychedelic experience, the dose of both the psychedelic and the cannabis, and the user's intention are all likely to play a pretty major role in shaping how cannabis will interact with psychedelics. There's a pretty big difference between consuming a little bit of cannabis at a difficult moment in the psychedelic experience compared to taking a high dose of cannabis at the peak of a psychedelic experience. So the real question is, could cannabis, when used intentionally, actually boost the therapeutic potential of psychedelics? We don't know yet, but it's a question worth answering, especially given how often these substances are already being combined in the real world. So here is the big picture. Across all the data, one signal strongly stands out. It's not metaphysical beliefs, it's insight that consistently predicts better outcomes following psychedelic use. While mystical experiences and spiritual beliefs may be meaningful, it's the grounded personal realizations, these psychological insights, that seem to drive long term change in individuals. And interestingly, cannabis may play a subtle supporting role in that process. By amplifying ego dissolution, cannabis could increase the likelihood that those insights emerge, especially in these naturalistic exploratory settings where these substances are often already being combined. And that doesn't mean cannabis is a psychedelic or that more is always better, but it does mean we should start paying attention to how these compounds interact, not just pharmacologically, but psychologically. Ultimately, the question we should be asking isn't what causes a mystical experience. The question is what helps people understand themselves better? Because based on this research, that seems to be where the transformations begin. So that is the story so far. We're beginning to uncover what really drives psychedelic benefits, and the evidence points to something so deeply human, which is the power of insight. And as we think about what supports those insights, whether it's ego dissolution or therapeutic intent or even cannabis, we get closer to understanding how to guide these experiences in ways that are safe and effective and, importantly, meaningful. So I'd love to hear any thoughts or questions, whether it's about the findings or the theories or the broader implications of this research. So happy to open it up.
All right. Thank you, Kaitlyn, for your very informative presentation. We will now jump into the Q&A portion of the webinar. If you happen to have a question that you would like to ask, please do so now. Just submit a question in the Ask a Question box located at the bottom of your screen. It looks like we have a couple of questions here that we can go ahead and get started with. Okay, our first question is, what do these findings suggest for the design of psychedelic assisted therapy?
I love that question. And I think that's why this research is most impactful is we can immediately apply some of these insights. And I think what it suggests is that however we're approaching this psychedelic assisted therapy should be aimed to support people in being reflective on details of their life, of what they're dealing with in the moment, any struggles or challenges they may have, by drawing our attention to those aspects of our lives during those experiences. I think this research suggests that we're far more likely to then have these insights and see some benefits. The finding that therapeutic intent is predictive of the insights to me supports that, where it's possible that if all we do is make sure the person goes into it with the goal of growth in some way, that may be more likely to happen.
All right, wonderful. Okay, it looks like we have one more question here so far. So again, to the audience, if you have any questions that you would like to ask, feel free to type those into the Ask a Question box. If not, we'll go ahead and wrap up with this final question here. It says, could psychological insight be enhanced in non-psychedelic therapeutic settings using similar mechanisms?
I'm speculating, but I do think so. I know that in meditation, some research on meditation, there seems to be some overlap with what happens with psychedelics. I think this is about shifting from top down processing to more bottom up, where we are taking in more information from our environment, from our external stimuli. And so it's possible that if we are able to aim to shift focus in that way, where we are trying to increase the bottom up perception, we may be able to elicit a similar response to what we're seeing here, even without the assistance of psychedelics. Very speculative, but I do think that that seems promising.
All right, wonderful. Well, thank you again, Kaitlyn, for your time today and for your very important research. Before we go, I would like to thank the audience for joining us today and for their interesting questions. Questions that we did not have time for today and those submitted during the on demand period will be addressed by the speaker via the contact information you provided at the time of registration. This webcast can be viewed on demand for 1 year until April 16th, 2026. LabRoots will alert you via email when it's available for replay. We encourage you to share that email with your colleagues who may have missed today's live event. Until next time, goodbye, everybody.
Thank you.